present in the same order that they appear in the schedule. They are Julio Huato, who is an associate professor of economics at St. Francis College, and also a member of our Science and Society editorial board and manuscript collective and steering committee of IRPI, and a person of very widespread theoretical and historical interests. Michael Perlman. I don't have any books that I can point to, but he's written tons of them. He is from California State University, Chico, and he writes about a book a month. Well, maybe not quite. And he also manages to travel very widely. I see him in China.
We just follow you.
Yeah, he follows me. We were always managed to get together. And Michael Hudson from University of Missouri, Kansas City, and also from the Levy Institute up at Bard College. And here we have materials on display, recent books, Financial Capitalism and Its Discontents, and The Bubble and Beyond, with a subtitle, Fictitious Capital, Debt Deflation, and Global Crisis. A prolific author and speaker. He's also, by the way, one of my favorite commentators on Russia Today, where I spot him from time to time. So these are our panelists, and we're going to set a generous 20-minute limit, but the timekeeping, which is my sole responsibility, is going to be strict. So I will let the speakers know when they're at the 15-minute point and then when the time is up. So we will begin with Julio Huato.
Okay, to keep myself contained in the 20-minute time period that I have, I'm going to read off the screen here. As I understand it, some authors, I think Michael among them, argue that modern capitalism has experienced a transformation whereby industrial capitalist production has become subordinated to or dominated by finance. And this goes contrary to Marx's expectations, Karl Marx's expectations, that as capitalism develops further, industrial capitalists would become the dominant group among the capitalists, whereas banking and finance would become merely subservient to the industrial capitalists. There are some authors like Jerry Epstein from Amherst, Tom Paley, and others who made similar claims. So finance is this bundle of largely unproductive, largely wasteful, if not outright criminal activities that consist of trafficking with promises of future payments, pieces of paper, PDF files, whatever, that entitle people to holders to future economic benefits, and that those activities may provide tangible benefits to some individuals, wealthy individuals, powerful individuals, privileged individuals, but at the expense of the greater macroeconomic fragility and risk for the rest of us. In this context, the notion of finance advances that of pretty much fraudulent activities that violate not only the alleged norms of market competition, but also basic legal and ethical standards. And that when the increasing power of finance does not completely manage to reshape legislation to favor itself in policy making and even the ethical and aesthetic norms of society, that they are willing to cross the line between what is lawful and what is criminal. So finance capitalism is associated with swindle, fraud, white-collar criminal behavior. So I am not going to argue here that finance capitalism is not all of that. In one of the last pages of Volume 1 of Capital, Marx has a quote. Unfortunately, as I was typing this morning, I didn't have internet, so I couldn't go online and check exactly where the quote was and who the author of this quote is, but it must be some obscure English political economist that Marx digged out of oblivion. And he says something like this. This is what I remember. It's not a textual quote, but he says that capital eschews no profit. That if you give me something like 20%, I will be like bold. If you give me like, 50%, I will be audacious. If you give me 100%, I'm ready to trample any human law. If you give me 300%, then there is no crime, heavenly or earthly, that I will not be willing to commit, even at the risk of being executed or, of course, enduring hell in the afterlife. So, amen, brother, right? But that applies not only to pushing papers and trafficking with promises of future payments, but it applies to any other activity, productive wealth or not productive wealth. And of course, the decision of what is wealth and what is not is ultimately something that has to be socially validated. It's people who decide what kind of things are helpful to them or useful to them as opposed to harmful to them. But so in my view, and this is something that I owe Marx a lot to, is this notion that there is no social order, there is no economic regime that can be entirely based on theft and fraud and the forceful appropriation of wealth. That the essential characteristic of capitalism is not exploitation, is not the appropriation of someone else's wealth. That the essential characteristic of capitalism is the particular way in which exploitation is carried out. And indeed, that the normal form of exploitation under capitalism is accompanied by excesses, by abuses, and all those quote-unquote anomalies. And moreover, that those excesses and those abuses are magnified, they are turbocharged by the explosive power of energy that capitalism unleashes. So, indeed, we expect to see a lot of abuses, a lot of fraud, a lot of that, but that is not the essential characteristic of capitalism. That the real problem of capitalism is not its excesses, but it's its normal modus operandi. It's the normal way in which it operates. So it's not the abuses, but the uses that are the problem. So the Marxist in me tells me that if finance has gotten so fat in modern times, it is because there is a lot of fatty food, there is a lot of carbo-laden food around, and that the food that feeds financial capital obviously has to be produced, has to be reproduced, anew continuously, recurrently, and that we shouldn't lose sight of that fact. So if the rentiers can live off the rents, dividends, capital gains, whatever, right, ill-gotten or, rightfully earned under the norms of the system, that if these rents are getting bigger, that means that is because somebody is producing the wealth that they are appropriating in those forms, in the form of rents, dividends, capital gains, etc. So if theft and fraud nowadays can fetch through, financial transactions, etc., it can now fetch these huge booties. It is because working people, are producing that much wealth. And that is something that when we focus a lot on finance, on monetary phenomena, then that tends to recede to the background, and instead of being exposed as part of kind of the hidden side, the hidden part of the iceberg. So wealth cannot be produced, cannot be reproduced by shuffling and reshuffling pieces of paper, PDF files, contracts, agreements among people, and that's what financial securities are ultimately all about. They are claims over wealth, and by shuffling them and reshuffling them, we are not multiplying wealth. What we are doing is simply redistributing those claims, and but wealth has to be produced the hard way, which requires, of course, the mobilization of physical resources, means of production, human bodies with brains. So the more formidable finance appears as a device to pump or extract and appropriate wealth by the few, the more we should infer that wealth is being produced, and is being produced dynamically. So So I should clarify here that if we are in the business of exposing capitalism because we want it overthrown, and I think we are in that business, of course, then it is fair to denounce the abuses, the excesses, because those excesses are inherent to capitalism. They are phenomenic, but they are also essential because they reflect the essence of the system, which is, profit making, the drive to appropriate surplus. So they are inherent to it. They are part of its modus operandi, but they are not the entire thing. So because we are not only in the business of denouncing, in the business of agitating, we are also in the business of understanding, because we have to replace capitalism with something better. And so that means that we have to be hard-nosed, realistic about it. And so it is also important that we understand that ultimately underneath the phenomenon of finance, there is capitalist production, right? Capitalist production. Because if we don't do this, I'm afraid that the populist message is the one that prevails. And the populist message that I get from these views is that if we could only remove these excesses, if we could only remove these abuses, then capitalist production would be healthy, and that would be for the for the well-being of everybody. If Main Street is left alone, right? If you remove those oppressive Wall Street bankers that are choking off Main Street, then everything would be hunky-dory. I strongly disagree with this view. In my view, finance is parasitic, but all capitalist activities, capitalist production, the production of the most noble, the most useful for the most healthy food, etc., is also parasitic in the sense that it's a profit-seeking activity. Thank you. All capital is parasitic, whether it is involved in productive activities or not, because the source of all property income, I'm using a term that is routinely utilized by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Feel free to, the Bureau of Economic Analysis splits national income into two great categories: labor income and property income. I think this terminology is pretty good. I like that, property income, so that means that your income doesn't come from your work. It comes from the fact that because of a social arrangement that we have that we call private ownership, right? It's a social arrangement, it's not a natural right, right? Because of that, you have rights over property. And because of that, you can extract, right, part of the output produced by the labor of those who work. So labor income versus property income is a pretty good classification, except that when they do the statistics, sometimes they mix up things. But so all property income ultimately comes from what Marx calls surplus value. And so on the surface, what we see is the income of different individuals. So if you have property, so you have income such as rent, such as dividends or profits, such as, if you are a top manager, you boss people around, then you get, some sort of corporate management compensation. If you are a plain worker or employee, you will receive a wage or a salary. In the surface, what we see is these things, but where actually is in dispute is the wealth, right, that is produced, for example, in a given year, right? So all of this income is nothing but the phenomenic form in which this product that is produced in a given year is claimed by individuals. So this is the problem of distribution. But underneath that, even underneath the dispute over how the product is distributed among the newly produced product is distributed among the social classes, ultimately, and this is I think an insight of Marx, what we have is a dispute over Marx wouldn't use these mystical terms, but it's a dispute over the human soul. It's how the spirit of humanity, which is purposeful activity, what Marx called labor, right? It's a dispute over our conscious or focused time, right? I think nowadays we understand pretty keenly how the ultimate resource that we have in life is the mindful time, is our time when we are actually aware, deliberate, willful, right? And we carry out our life in a purposeful manner. So it is the dispute over that, it is the dispute over labor, right, which is measured in time units, right? The dispute over a given day, how much of my time is going to be devoted to my own enrichment, the enrichment of my personality, the enjoyment of life for its own sake, or to what extent that's going to be hijacked from me, taken away from me, turned into an alien power that is going to oppress me, property, capital, something that is going to allow the holder of that to extract, to actually take that part of me, that part of my spirit, that part of my lifetime, right, and enjoy it for their own private benefit and at my expense. That, in my view, that is really the essence of capital. So, but regarding this issue of financialization, actually, I assume, and I think it was right that I did so, I assumed that I wasn't going to have technology to project. So I was going to, I looked data and all that, but I didn't bring any charts or any handouts. But I'm going to make a few remarks that are a little bit narrower, and they are about how to understand the expansion of finance or financial activities as they are conventionally measured, say by the Bureau of Economic Analysis and other statistical agencies, right? Thank you. The growth of finance at the expense of other areas of the economy, how to understand it. All individual capitals, right? All individual capitals have to carry out certain activities that have to do with the handling of money, right? You have to be engaged with funding, right, or whatever activity you carry out. If you are a capitalist, right, you're going to have to deal with money, with liquid funds, with liquid securities, whatever. And so Marx in Capital says something that also resonates with me in my understanding of finance. Marx says, the development of modern banking, right, actually is in part at least explained by the fact that some of these activities that had to be carried out individually by individual capitalists, right, in the early stages of capitalist development, individual capitalists have to handle all of these activities, right? They had to be involved with granting credit to their customers, etc., or with managing their funds, etc. All of those activities are being centralized, right, by large banks. And these large banks are actually reducing the amount of waste, the amount of unproductive activities that individual capitals otherwise would have to carry out. Right? You may say that this is kind of similar to some of the arguments that justify made by conventional economists that justify the expansion of finance. And you would be right, because in that sense you can see a little bit of a coincidence. Even though Marx was radically critical of capitalism, he also understood that, with the large that large banks were capable of exploiting economies of scale, and this way, right, it was possible for individual capitals to farm out some of these activities. Just like John Jay has to manage its facilities, plumbing, electric system, etc., right? And individual capitals have to also manage their money, manage their funds, manage their portfolios. However, it is possible to transfer those activities to large banks. And large banks, of course, these are large capitalist enterprises, but they are going to do it for profit. And then to the extent that you take a process, right, it's a unit, it's a single whole, and you take a part of it and then you stretch it, then there is possibility that by fracturing this unity into parts, that some of the parts are going to stretch too far, and to the point that the only way in which this unit may have to be reestablished is going to be in a very violent fashion, right, through a crisis, right? So by the fact that you can that you can take these activities that otherwise would have to be carried out by individual capitals and that now are carried out by specialized, organizations, large banks. It is possible that you're going to have more turbulence, more instability. So I'm saying that there are two sides to that. On the one side, right, under normal times, and this would be the emphasis on the normal times, right, there is saving of wasteful activities for individual capitals. But this at the expense, of course, the greater turbulence, because now these large organizations are going to run with it. The other thing that I want to mention is that capital is a global system. So just because we see finance in New York or London or Frankfurt or Zurich to expand greatly, right, that doesn't mean that we have to correlate that only with industrial activity in those countries, right? The phenomenon of financialization coincided, I'm just wrapping this up, coincided with also with a tremendous expansion in capitalist production, capitalist, parasitic, right, exploitative production in China, in India, in other parts of the world, massive. So that means that, it's not only, the industrialized experience of the United States that has to be connected with financialization in the United States, but we also have to take into consideration the fact that finance in the United States may have been also responsible for, enabling the capitalist production expansion in China, etc. And I'll stop there because my time is up.
Michael Perlman.
How can I follow that? I mean, banking, there are two concepts in Marx that I think are very useful in thinking about finance. One is a short remark that he made in the Grundrisse: all economics is the economics of time. Marx was in a sense following up Benjamin Franklin, who humorously solved the transformation problem before it was ever posed by talking about time is money. So those of you who are working on the transformation money problem now have your answer. I'm struck by the importance of war in banking and the creation of banking. But banking is also, as Julio said, very important for dealing with this question of timing. I will try to talk, maybe I can put this closer. Is that better?
Tilt it up to your face.
The mic is not for there is no sound system here. So we just have to talk loud.
Okay, I didn't know that. That's why I thought you were talking so loudly, because you had the microphone. Okay, let me stand up then and try to talk. And I'll try to talk louder. Am I okay now?
Much better.
The other concept of Marx is the concept of what he called the mortal leap. And I think it's a beautiful concept. And that is, between the time that the capitalist has to lay out money, there can be breaks in the circuit of circulation or in the circuits of production. And finance is necessary for that. So yeah, finance plays an important role in facilitating capitalist production. At the same time, finance also creates dangers for capitalist production. The old Hegelian unity of opposites. That we saw what happened in 2007 when the financial system took down much of the industrial system. Those two things go together. Now the question is, when does finance become such that it interferes with what Marx called capitalism's historic mission, which is to accumulate capital to provide the basis to go to a different kind of society? And there you run into a lot of difficulties with finance of what it does. In 1857, Marx was intensively interested in the speculation that caused a big collapse at the time. So he's very, very knowledgeable about the dysfunctionality of capitalism, of finance, and how it can be extractive and can operate to the detriment of accumulation. So it does both. And you cannot generalize one or the other. Let's talk about capitalism and war, because war is an essential part of capitalism too. And that is, I'm just finishing up a manuscript on early capitalism. And what struck me was all of these early capitalists in the mid-1600s, early 1700s, were totally concerned with war and the finance of war. And later you'll find that the Bank of England was established merely to create funding for the previous wars. So these early economists were very, very tied up with war. You go back in banking and you find that there are two sources. One is war, and one is this question of mortal leap. War, the first banks are, of course, the banks of the Knights Templar, which are holding money for pilgrims and for knights that are off there in the Middle East. And then as trade moves toward Italy, Italy starts creating profit-making banks. And then banks move up toward Holland, as Holland becomes the center of trade, and then finally to England, becomes the financial center of the world. These economists are looking at the banks and trying to get schemes to raise money for the wars that are necessary for trade, which are also necessary for capitalism. The leader of the Dutch East India Company, Jan Pieterszoon Kroon, they once said, there's no war without trade and no trade without war. The two are tied up together. And part of the financing that you get right now in the US, we have all this talk about deficit, but the deficit is, of course, back to war. Wars that we fight, wars that we plan, wars that, go on. It's very hard to get that. Now, when you get into finance, finance takes on a life of its own. This is also a concept of Marx, that when he's talking about fictitious capital, he's talking about how fictitious capital can take a life of its own. And what we see now in the United States today is, at least on the eve of the Great Recession, I don't know why we call it a recession, on the eve of the Great Recession, 40% of all profits were going to the FIRE section, finance, insurance, real estate. I think it's a beautiful name because of the disruptiveness of what they do. Some of it is productive, some of it is destructive. And when I was thinking about the talk, the name Michael Milken came to mind. Michael Milken is very interesting in that he represented to some people the creative side of finance. That is, companies like MCI were financed by what Michael Milken and his junk bonds. And Michael Milken was so good at accumulating finance, supposedly when he got the deal for MCI, he raised $1 billion in an hour. Not many of us could call our friends and in an hour raise $1 billion. MCI became very valuable, but then it becomes part of WorldCom, involved in another financial scandal, and it disappears. Okay. So at the same time, Michael Milken is one of the founders of the private equity business. He's considered to be responsible for the savings and loan crisis, and it's very interesting. At the time when Michael Milken was at his peak, he had an income of $500 million a year. To put that into context, before the escalation of financial salaries, that was equal to the $500 million that was the wealth of J.P. Morgan when he died. J.P. Morgan, seemed to own everything. He had $500 million. Of course, his $500 million, if we allowed for inflation, would be higher, but it's still the same. But the number $500 million still sticks in my mind because Milken held responsible, or one of the chief culprits in creating the savings and loan crisis, which caused the American taxpayer $500 million. So finance is parasitic. At the same time, it's productive, and we need to sort that out, and I think that's what you were trying to say. And the costs of finance come in all sorts of ways. One, finance has certain powers, and it allows them to get whatever political legislation they want, and this costs us in any number of ways. That is, it's a major factor in creating the inequality that is holding the economy back, disrupting capitalists' financial historic mission. So then we go and we look at this finance and we see that it is creating enormous wealth, but without producing. There's a new book by Kostas Lapatidis about profits without production, which is excellent if anyone's interested in Marx and finance. It's a fantastic book. It's very long, very thick, and very interesting. I recommend it very highly. Is that enough? Repeat
the title, please.
Profits without production. But at the same time, like Julio, he goes to great lengths to make the case that finance also serves productive purposes. So just as capitalists are exploitive, capitalism does produce certain benefits. I mean, here I have my tablet, but we still can do better. Where do we see, now Marx had another concept which brings us into finance, and that is secondary exploitation. It's something that Marxists don't talk about a lot, but secondary exploitation is the exploitation that comes in the circuits of capital. You're shaking your head?
No, I'm listening.
Okay, exploitation comes in the circuits of capital. Things like payday loans, check cashing, very, very high profits, taking advantage of the most disadvantaged, and they're very profitable. And again, JP Morgan Chase and all the big banks engage in this to great profits, because what they do then is they get into another kind of secondary exploitation. What you do is you open the banks up to your checking account for your payday loan, and if you don't pay it, then the bank charges you a fee too, a late fee on your money, and it accumulates at a tremendous rate. So this is where the poor schnooks get their exploitation. Business gets exploitation from finance. Until Dodd-Frank, the banks were able to take enormous profits out of merchants, small and large, to the point that Walmart was crying that the swipe fees were so high. And the swipe fees are something that the banks have to put very little labor into. And then 1/1,000,000th of a penny worth of electricity, and they get their money. So finance is hitting us that way. Finance distorts the economy, and you go back to this private equity that Milken was starting, and you see that private equity now is doing everything they can to milk companies. What do? They'll buy your company, they'll use your pension fund as collateral to buy it, they'll borrow money, and they'll raise money from stockholders, and then the companies go bankrupt. The mattress industry is very interesting in this respect when we think about the productivity of capital. Simmons Mattress was turned over to 6 different private equity companies, and the Teachers' Pension of Ontario was left holding the bag on the last one. So here's a company, you take all of its assets, you load it up with debt, you sell it off to the stock market, you can charge fees. The New York Times just had an article about this. You can charge fees to the company even after it's sold. For several years, they'll still have to pay these high management fees. So the company goes bankrupt again, the next private equity company picks it up over and over and over. Fortunately, we had somebody who taught the public about private equity recently, our Republican candidate for president, Mitt Romney. But unfortunately, nobody did a good deal of work except a few union activists to talk about how destructive that operation was. But it really serves to promote the idea of deindustrialization. Another thing finance does is everybody knows that the stock prices go up when a company says they're going to lay off workers. And that's so profitable that companies are now making announcements of layoffs, even though their labor force is already bare bones and they're not going to lay anyone else off without shutting off the lights and closing the door. But you certainly see finance extracting a great deal out of labor where you have financial demands in terms of making the stock market high enough, protecting against unfriendly takeovers. So the companies then cut. The workers are the ones that get stuck. Their pension plans, their health care plans get, again, another form of I don't know if that'd be primary or secondary exploitation. They cut them both ways. So you have this system, it's terribly unproductive. And what you see in the United States, if you look at manufacturing in the United States, it tends to go down. And where it does go up, it goes up largely on the basis of intellectual property laws, which are another form of exploitation and could be considered another form of. So when you have manufacturing of some electronics, most of the costs of that are going to finance that's being held by other places. You also have another function of finance, and that is to help funds move offshore so nobody has to pay taxes. And then what that means is there will be pressure on Social Security, pressures on Medicare to cut them back, all for predatory finance. So our giant sucking, I almost wanted to use another one. Oh God. Our giant sucking vampire squid is very busy. And it has these tendons going out in all directions, sucking in every way. So while I agree with Julio that no, it's not just that finance is bad, capitalism is bad, but finance is also part of capitalism. And unless we can get some control of the financial system, we can't get control of the political system, and we cannot be able to create an industrial system that will create decent jobs for people. That is, I just had a class of students graduate, and I know the kind of jobs they're getting, and I know the kind of jobs they should be getting. And all that has to do with that giant sucking vampire squid. And yeah, it does some good. And we have to look at this in a form of balance. Now, so I hope I've made that case for balance. And I hope I've taught you the solution to the transformation problem. And I guess that's my 5 minutes. So thank you.
Our last speaker is Michael Hudson.
I think the name for this talk is a misnomer. To consider the vampire squid as a parasite. It's not a parasite. It's another animal. When parasitism in nature is usually part of a symbiosis. It's usually a small organism that invades the host. When a vampire squid attacks a prey, you know that there's no symbiosis there. It's coming from the outside, and you know what it does. It kills the prey. That's what dumb capitalists do. That's what Goldman Sachs does. It kills the prey. But that's not really how parasites work in nature. The parasites, first of all, need to keep the host alive, because if the host dies, then it can't provide any blood. What is it that the parasite really wants? It wants the host's surplus value. It wants the bloodstream. It wants the nourishment that the host takes in and feeds the parasite. The problem is, if you're a parasite, how do you get the host to feed you? Most hosts would not willingly take on a parasite. So every kind of a parasite in nature, from the Lyme disease mites to insects to amoebas, they all are very complex organisms within themselves. They have an enzyme that they infuse into the host that works right on the host's brain. And the first thing they do is they have a kind of Novocaine when they bite you so that you don't feel the bite. It's as if it's not there. You don't sense it, and the parasite's there. And the first thing the parasite does is, once it gets to your brain, it tries to convince you that it's part of the host's own body. Not only part of the host, but the body favors the parasite. The body comes to think of the parasite as its child, to be protected. And the purpose of the host from the time the parasite comes in is to protect. The host wants to protect the parasite and help it nurture so it can get to the point where ultimately the host does die, because we all die in the end. But what's going to happen when we die? When the vampire squid kills its prey, it has to go on and find somebody new. But when the parasite dies, how does it go and find somebody new? Because it's only a little kid. It's only like a little insect or a little like amoeba. It has to convince the host to get devoured by some other animal so that the parasite gets in the other animal's organism and then passes through that. Usually it's a triangular life cycle. It's a very complex life cycle. So what we're dealing with is a kind of symbiosis in a large and a complex system. It's not simply attacking, looting, and emptying out, as Michael has described quite correctly, hedge funds doing, and as Goldman Sachs has described doing. So the intelligent parasite treats the host as almost helpful, and many parasites actually help the host find food. They want to do everything they can to sort of steer the host, sort of like the animals the suckerfish that ride on sharks, and sort of steer them along. Well, the success of financial parasitism in our economy is to convince the economy that banking and finance are actually part of the host economy itself. And when the Wall Street Journal refers to Wall Street and the super rich, the 1%, as being job creators, the idea is to make the host economy think these are not job destroyers. They're not here to impose austerity, to make us look like Greece and Ireland and Iceland and empty us out. They're here to create our jobs. That's why Michael Milken was so widely applauded. And when Michael mentioned earlier that 40% of U.S. profits are in the fire sector, it's as if somehow we're all part of GDP, and somehow the finance, insurance, and real estate are all services. And they're services, they provide a service. If you provide a service, that's not taking from you, that's providing a service. Well, that's a parasite's view of the world. Of course, he's providing a service for the host. He's keeping the host alive so that ultimately he can, the host's job is to feed the parasite so its children can hatch, devour the host, and then move on and be devoured by yet larger hosts, which I guess is the equivalent of multinational investment, coming from the dying economy into economies abroad that are lesser parasitized, such as Russia and the Ukraine. The key point, I think, that since we're here at the LET Forum to discuss is how is it that the host has become so disabled that it doesn't realize that it's been parasitized, that it thinks of finance as its child, to be nurtured as the leading sectors, and to the point that the allocator of resources in our economy is Wall Street, not the government, or not any entity that actually seeks to create profits in the classical sense of the term, which is the sense that Marx used. Profits to Marx were made by employing labor to produce goods and services to sell at a markup, surplus value. But that's not really what finance does to make money. It makes money off money, M to M prime. without the MC M prime intervening. And that's how almost all of the gains in the 1% have been made since 1980. It hasn't been largely by profits. In fact, it's been the more a financialized industrial company has to pay the financial sector, the less profit it has, because finance is a cost of business and interest is crowding out profits. Just like interest payments, mortgage interest, student loans, credit card debt is crowding out disposable personal income in shrinking markets. So what the U.S. economy and the European economies are experiencing today is a shrinking of the economic surplus because it's all being absorbed by the financial sector that is not flowing it into the economy, like Say's law says, that production creates its own demand. Employers will pay their workers so that they have enough money to buy what the employers produce. But if the workers have to pay high mortgage payments for houses that are inflated on credit, if they have to set aside money in their pension funds to be turned over to Drexel Burnham to invest in crooked S&L loans, if they have to pay for their education, they're not going to be able to buy the goods and services they produce. So the circular flow of income within the economy is drained by the financial sector. Now, the whole idea of national income accounting originally was based on circular flow from William Petty, but most of all, Quenet, the physiocrat in France. Petty and Quenet were surgeons. They were doctors, and they used the idea of circular flow within the body to depict the economy is a human body with a bloodstream flowing, and when J.B. Say said, well, okay, this is the circulation of blood is like the circulation between producers and consumers in the economy, employers and their workers, he didn't take into account what the British classical economists were talking about, and that is the rentier rake-off. In 200 years ago, the main rentiers were landlords extracting rent. But today, on top of the landlord's back, you have finance. And most of the big real estate investors buy their properties on mortgage. They try to debt leverage. The idea of almost all real estate speculators is rent is for paying interest. And if you're a consumer, you're making an income to pay interest. You have to make enough income so that you can afford to pay off the student debt you've taken out, so you can afford to buy the house that you need to live, and so you can afford to pay the interest on the debt you've taken off. Now, 100 years ago, almost all the socialist parties of the world had the idea that money and credit should become part of the socialized capitalist economy as a public function. And the idea, and certainly what Marx expected, was that for industrial capitalism to transform the characteristic of finance so it would no longer be parasitic. Marx used the term parasite in relation to finance when he said that the financial parasite makes the economy save, but it makes it save to pay the financial sector. That literally has been what's happened in the American national income accounts since 2008. The amount of banks have stopped lending. The amount of debt has gone on. In 2008, the saving rate for the U.S. economy was 0. And that's because there was plenty of saving by the 1%, but the saving by the 1% was all lent out to the 99% to become its debt. And so the 99% basically was working to pay the 1% who said, well, don't worry about debt, we owe it to ourselves. The ourselves were them, and the we were the 99% paying it to ourselves. And all of this is sort of buried under the fact of thinking of the financial sector as part of the body. Now, normally, a healthy body would develop antibodies to the parasite. It would be aware that the parasite's there, and it would design policies to deal with the parasites. And this is what the social democratic parties of Europe did 100 years ago. That's what the labor parties have did. Now let's fast forward to to last Sunday. And the elections in Europe, all the papers said, look at what's happened. Look at all the big change. There's been an immense rise in the nationalistic parties, the right-wing parties, except for Syriza in Greece. And that was almost the entire headline. But actually, that wasn't the main lesson of the election last week in Europe. First of all, the big change was a sharp drop in turnout voting. Most of the population was not going to vote for the right-wing parties, and they certainly weren't going to vote for the ultra-right-wing, which are the socialist parties and the labor parties. How is it that the socialist parties of a year ago are now the leading advocates of austerity in Europe? The Socialist Party, Papandreou in Greece, the head of the Socialist International, imposed the austerity taxes in the program from Europe and fell from over 50% of the Greek vote in his time to 8% last Sunday. The entire world now realizes we have a parasite, and that parasite is a socialist party. And of course, it's not the kind of socialism you and I mean. It's the socialism of the vampire squid, the large financial banks. From Tony Blair's move to New Labour Party, serving the city of London, which is the banking sector, to Clinton, serving Wall Street, you have the Democratic Party, all of the parties that used to be on the left, who somehow, in their attempt to criticize industrial employers, they don't realize that the industrial employers, as well as the working class and labor, are both being parasitized by the financial sector. They somehow act as if the financial sector is sort of independent, or else it's part of the industrial sector. And I do not have any documentation on what I was told in the 1960s, both by Seymour Mellman and by Terence McCarthy, that most of the travel fees and housing for the meetings at the Socialist International were all paid for by the CIA. It's not necessary to have the actual documentation. All you have to realize is that there's an immense amount of money coming out of the U.S. government and also by Wall Street and the Ford Foundation and the large foundations to support to somehow turn the socialist parties and the left away from what it was 100 years ago, from having an economic program to criticize the rentiers, to tax economic rent, to tax real estate, to put banking into the public domain, all of a sudden to make the focus non-economic topics, such as you see in the books downstairs. A lot of these are cultural, sexual. The one thing you're not going to find is a discussion of finance. So finance has successfully parasitized most of the left-wing political parties, as it's parasitized the industrial economy itself. You can see what's happened similarly in the Ukraine. What is a country such as the Ukraine supposed to do when, at the last New York Review of Books, George Soros wrote his idea for the Ukraine? The kleptocrats should sell out to us Western investors as partners, and we'll help rationalize what they do to the Ukraine. By the way, there's a very good book on the Ukraine that was just published by press on, I have to put in a plug for that, a whole group of articles, Flashpoint in Ukraine. The idea is that Soros and the West wants to essentially convince the kleptocrats that the West will support what it takes, as long as they can then take their companies, issue them on the stock exchange. And remember, Russia, after the Russian neoliberals took over after 1991, Russia was the leading stock market in the whole world. The post-Soviet markets were the leading markets because they were not yet parasitized. So you can look at this whole process as Drexel Burnhamizing the post-Soviet economies. It's bewildering to me why most of the discussions, even of Marx on the left, are all Volume 1 Marxists. If you read Volume 3, that's all about what I've talked about. In volume 3, Marx talks all about the exponential growth of debt, the tendency of debt to grow faster than the economy. That's why how Marx attributed financial crisis to. And I think that really should be the takeoff point for realizing that you need to recast the national income accounts. So instead of showing the fire sector as part of the economy, you look at it as overhead. It's not part of the economy. It's the parasite. It's the extractive part of the economy. Its income is not productive investment. It's extractive investment. And this contradiction between productive and extractive investment was the core of all classical economics. That was the aim of Marx in writing his theories of surplus value. It's all to collect what every economist had written about the distinction between productive and unproductive labor, unproductive and productive investment, right down the line. And the move against Marxism was basically a move against the whole thrust of the preceding 100 years, 200 years of classical economics that did this to somehow in the 1890s depict all of the economy as being a single homogeneous organism, as if there was no parasite. And that's what neoliberalism is. And that's what your economics is taught today in the schools, that it's all part of a single organism. There's no such thing as unproductive income. All income is earned, and everybody earns in proportion to what they produce. This is what J.B. They give a prize for him every year. The American Clark, J.B. Clark said. And it's significant that the American Economic Association's prize that liberals like Krugman won are called the J.B. Clark Memorial Prize because it's the prize for denying there is any such thing as parasitism. And if the left can elaborate that point, it will be able to get the votes that are now going to the right in Europe.